David Bowie, Depeche Mode, Daft Punk, Coldplay, The Prodigy, The Human, LCD Sound
Gary
System,
Newman,
Susie and the
Orchestral
Banshees,
Maneuvers
Arthur
are
Baker,
Baker,
Derek
Joy
Division,
Division,
Juan
New Order,
Atkins,
Ramsey,
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 Yellow
Ramsey,
Orchestra,
Ramsey,
DJ
Ramsey,
Shack,
Ramsey,
Valenscu Quartet, The Divine Comedy, Ride, Fergie apparently, and most importantly, alongside millions of other artists, Senior Coconut y su Conjunto. These are all artists and bands who were inspired by, greatly influenced by, or just big fans of a little German four-piece called Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk are an experimental electronic and synth-pop band that gained a lot of notoriety in the 70s and early 80s, and are still active today, if under a different lineup. They are not the most popular band ever. In fact, the common person is at best vaguely familiar with who they are. However, as the years go on, it seems like more and more people are not only saying they successfully predicted the future, but that they are also more influential than the Beatles. The Beatles! How could that possibly be? Well, first of all, why do I even care about this old German band? For many years, I have been a huge fan of electronic music. Yes, if you skim my channel, you may think I only listen to Aphex Twin, but trust me, I love electronic music of all shapes and sizes. And Kraftwerk was always a band that I kinda knew about, especially how important and groundbreaking they apparently are. But for the longest time, I wasn't really interested. I thought that because this music was old, it would sound old and not have any of the modern stuff I love so much. You know how when old films and albums are touted as the greatest things ever made, but people say don't really understand why because those works of art establish things that are now just commonplace? That was basically my mentality. That's not to say I didn't dip into their music though. In 2019, based off a video by The Wonky Angle, I gave the Tour de France soundtracks a try, and then in a few years afterwards, I occasionally checked out other things like Autobahn, but nothing more than that. It wasn't until 2022 when I looked in the mirror and asked myself,
what the fuck are you doing?
It was then that I decided to right the wrong of not taking Kraftwerk seriously by listening to their entire discography, and it was one hell of an experience that has made me a fan ever since. And here I'll be going through their whole discography again with you, analyzing every album and the lore behind them in detail to show those skeptical why Kraftwerk is so special, as well as how they were able to become so influential. To do this though, we need to start at the beginning. So, let's go on a tour to Kraftwerk. Germany was not in the best place after World War II. Didn't think I'd start there, did ya? It was not only a country split in two, but also a country split off from its history and artistic tradition after the catastrophe that was the Third Reich. The country needed to recreate its identity and culture, all while separating itself from the cultural exports of the UK and US. An immense task for an entire society, let alone a few musicians. This was the state of things in 1968 when Ralf Hutter met Florian Schneider-Esleben at the Robert Schumann Conservatory in Dusseldorf. 2 years later, inspired by the world of random sounds around them, they would start making music together, first under the name of Organization, under which they released an album, and then Kraftwerk, meaning power plant in German. They were part of a wave of experimental rock acts popping out of Germany at the time like Can and Neu! Kraftwerk, alongside some other bands, also gained a valuable asset in producer Konrad Plank, who was very talented and very important when it came to the release of all these experimental albums which were quickly thrown under the mocking umbrella term of krautrock by the British music press. The recognition by the foreign media, though, did not translate to much attention for Kraftwerk outside of the German art world, and when there was attention, it was usually pretty negative. This did not stop Ralf and Florian from playing live and putting an album together. However, getting a consistent lineup was easier said than done. Ralf and Florian demanded total control over the music, especially the drumming, a strictness few could handle. And as we're about to find out, they were making some weird-ass music. The other members that cycled through the band in the early years, but especially around the recording of this album, include, and I have not practiced pronouncing any of these by the way, Basil Hamoudi, Butch Houff, Fred Monix, Thomas Lohman, Andreas Homan, Klaus Dinger and Michael Rother, later of Neu, Peter Schmidt, Hausheng Nejedepur, Eberhard Kraneman, Hans Gunther Charlie Weiss, Emil Schult, and Plato Caustic. They got fucking Plato?! Despite the inconsistent lineup, Kraftwerk's self-titled debut would come out in 1970, with everything except the drums being played by Ralf and Florian. The album cover is simply adorned with the band's name over the VLC, a traffic cone, which became their go-to logo for a few years, and the insides are dominated by an image of a transformer. The design's really boring. The album is made up of 4 lengthy experimental rock pieces, the first of which being Rucksuck, translating to Right Now. It almost immediately establishes this cool groove centered around Florian's percussive flute, backed by Ralf's looping keyboard. Over time, the track starts speeding up immensely before several violent jolts announce the arrival of creepy, rapid pulses that rise and fall in intensity. It's genuinely shocking, but it meanders for a lot longer than it should. In the last minute, though, the beginning section returns briefly, and there's even a fake ending. Going into listening to this album for the first time, I didn't know what to expect. I did know it was krautrock, but I didn't know what that was, and even if I did, it's such a wide-ranging label that it wouldn't have clued me in on a single thing. With that in mind, this track was an absolute sucker punch of a listen. It lures you in with this approachable groove, but then does everything in its power to stun and disorientate you. In that way, I really like its vibe and unpredictability. However, that also works to disrupt a lot of enjoyment I would have gotten from the song outside of a surreal sensory experience, which ruins its replay value for me. The same goes for the next track, Stradivarius. Its longest one here at 12 minutes, 4 of which are a tedious intro made up of creepy noises and industrial sound effects. Suddenly, a jolt starts the proper song, with several sections of plucked and squealing guitar set over a steady beat, separated by short instrumental freakouts. I can't deny, it rocks pretty hard, especially when it speeds up, but it never lasts long. After a calmer passage, it starts building up only to suddenly end. Once again, they're keeping us on our toes, but that was the only part of the song I was actually interested in. While Stradivarius has some cool moments, the whole song is dominated by a host of grating and cringeworthy sounds. I mean, at one point, their guitars start sounding like alarm clocks and the Nokia ringtone. That combined with the disappointing ending makes it my least favorite track here and one of the band's worst tracks ever. Thankfully, my favorite in megahertz is next. It once again has a creepy but shorter intro made of deep grumbling synths. It then transitions to a duo of heavenly soundscapes made up of calming keys as well as a few other instruments like a ringing triangle. It's really relaxing, offering a place of respite after the album's first half. It's also ambient music 8 years before it would be named, showing that even in this weird early stage of Kraftwerk's career, they were making sounds rarely, if ever, heard before. The final track, Von Himmel hoch, or From Heaven Above, starts with a series of weird buzzing drones, alarms, and an explosion similar to Pink Floyd's On the Run. Once again, this intro is too long at 4 minutes, but ends with intense kicks that build up into a tribal rhythm accompanied by keys that sound like a cross between a didgeridoo and Squidge in the Fridge. It's slow and unstable, but in the last few minutes it pops off and goes super hard. It makes for a satisfying climax to the album, although it's short and you have to wait a long time for it. Of all the tracks on this album, this one is the most popular for its use in the famous First Techno video. This video is a segment from Kraftwerk's first ever recorded live gig in 1970, the one you're watching right now, and I absolutely love it. Not just because of the crowd's reactions that vary from lighthearted clapping to genuine confusion, but also because they're playing a song that sounds like Donald Duck getting beaten to death with straight faces. So that was Kraftwerk's first album. I think even people unfamiliar with them can tell that this is an oddity. I mean, it completely abandons traditional song structure in favor of controlled chaos. I'll be honest, I don't like it. It has some awesome sections with its primitive hard rock and proto-ambience, but they tend to be short and separated by long sections of some of the weirdest noises I've ever heard. Its pacing and replayability are atrocious, but it's obvious Kraftwerk didn't care about that. They wanted to shock the listener and push music into places never seen before. In that way, it was successful, and I respect it a little for that. However, that doesn't mean I'll ever pretend to enjoy this album at its worst and most uncomfortable moments.
Solitude in E minor.
Yeah, E minor, alright, yeah!
So Kraftwerk's debut album came out and it did get some attention in Germany, but not much anywhere else. Kraftwerk kept trucking along though, continuing to play live, make TV appearances, and work on the next record. However, they were still dealing with a revolving door of a lineup. Even Ralf briefly left. By the end of it though, Ralf and Florian had a new member by the name of Mr. Drew Machine. They used a drum machine. Their next album, simply entitled Kraftwerk 2, would come out at the start of 1972. Keeping in line with the similarities to the first album, Kraftwerk 2 has the exact same cover but with a green traffic cone now. Yeah, still boring. However, the insides have a funny collage of Ralf, Florian, Conrad, and their equipment. These close-ups of Ralf are especially goofy. With this title and cover, you'd be reasonable to assume that this album would be very similar to their debut. But you'd be wrong. Mostly. Like, this is still at its core an experimental rock record, but now it's far more chilled out and atmospheric, taking after something like Megahertz more than Von Himmel hoch. I have no doubts this was a purposeful change in sound, however the fact they couldn't replicate the dynamic drumming of the previous record anymore must have been a big influence. Clang Clang, the 17-minute behemoth of an opener, starts with a collection of percussive sounds resembling the title, almost sounding like the intro to some guided meditation. From there, the next 9 minutes of the track slowly wades through a beautiful section where Florian's flute dances over a quiet bed laid by Ralph's electric piano, a barely detectable but delightful bass, and a simple drum machine rhythm. Like Rucksuck, they also play with the speed of the tape occasionally, It slows down to a stop before entering a slower section focused on a repeating clang and Florian playing the first distinguishable melody of the piece while surrounded by a fragile, swirling wall of muffled notes. This section doesn't last long before the drum machine beat returns, now a lot faster. Ralf and Florian spend these final few minutes of the track messing around with their guitars. I guess they were trying to spice things up with this ending, but I don't think it was needed. As a whole though, I think Clang Clang is a lovely sound journey. It's relaxing, unobtrusive, and as a result of being the most stable track Kraftwerk have made so far, it makes some good music for going about your daily activities. After that is Atem, meaning breath, and breath it is, as it's just 3 minutes of heavily reverberated breathing. That's literally it. I guess I like the space the reverb gives to it, but this is literally just Kraftwerk ASMR. No thank you. We then enter the guitar-based side of this album with Strom, Spule, and Wellenlänge, or current, real 4, and wavelength respectively. All three of these are driven by aimless guitar noodling. Of these, Strom is my favorite as its distortion-filled intro and repeated cries of several woodwind instruments spice up the mix. It has a chill vibe, weirdly reminiscent of Swans 2, which I love to see. Spulevir and Wellenlänge, though, have almost nothing to them. It feels like they just boringly improvised on a guitar for 15 minutes straight. It's not even like the first record where it sounds improvised but actually had a lot of thought put into it. These tracks just sound made up on the spot. They do sound nice and Wellenlänge picks up near the end, however they don't go anywhere and don't sound nearly as interesting as Clang Clang. Harmonica is the somber finale to this album. It's a nice closer, being a simple little sentimental song. Three minutes is cutting it a bit too short though. I'd rather have more of this than 9 minutes of Wellenlänge. So Kraftwerk 2 is an interesting follow-up to the first album. I'd even say it's a sizable improvement. I really like the ambient approach they went for here, and it especially shines on a track like Clang Clang. The band seemed to agree too and possibly deemed it a mark of things to come, naming their studio after it, the same studio where they would invent new musical technology and create their grandest works. However, while these compositions are certainly pleasant to listen to, you could not deny the fact that many of the ideas explored here are either stretched beyond their limit or not deep at all, especially on the 4-track run from Atem through Wellenlänge, which takes up half the album. I still appreciate Kraftwerk 2 for what it is though. Like if you gave me a guitar and told me to make an album, it would sound a lot like this. Yes, that's because I don't know how to play a guitar, but what I'm trying to say is that this must have been fun to make. And that thought makes me more confident in saying that this album has more good to it than bad. Oh, that's new. When released, Kraftwerk 2 made even less of a splash than Kraftwerk 1, even in Germany. Sales were the least of the band's concerns though, as they were undergoing a transformation. No, not another round of Guess Who's a Member of the Band this week, although there were a few temporary members for live gigs. This was a change in sound. The first two albums had some electronic instruments, but now they're really starting to embrace them going into their next combined effort. They not only had the money to buy the latest electronic instruments because of Florian's father, a celebrated architect, but they were even inventing their own electronic instruments, like this drum pad, which allowed them to play a drum machine as if it were an actual drum set. Ralf and Florian recorded their next album by themselves in 1973 with the same producer, and these sessions resulted in Ralf und Florian, or just Ralf and Florian. You can already see this is different just from the cover, especially as this is their first album to prominently display their faces, something that would become central to their future branding. I still have to take points away for being so plain though. I mean, look at this. Florian's little music note is a nice touch, but for some reason they felt the need to print their names on it twice, and no, the alternate cover isn't much better. God, and I bet when we open up the album, we're gonna get the same mundane stuff as before. Holy shit! Look at all this color! Ralf and Florian's design is genuinely shocking when compared to previous albums. This is in part due to the wonderful back cover photo of the boys relaxing in Clang Clang Studios with their various instruments and neon nameplates, something they'd show off at live performances for the next several years. I really hope I'm not the only one who thinks they're the coolest things ever. The most important contributor to the design though is Emil Schult, who you may remember was briefly a member of the band. He's responsible for these comical and stunning collages that provide really cool imagery to go along with the music and finally give personality to these albums' designs. No wonder Emil Schult would stick around to help with further album artwork. Finally, going into the actual music, Ralf and Florian starts off on a very awkward note with Elektrisches Roulette. Its composition is incredibly messy, with electronic and acoustic elements popping in and out of the mix seemingly at random, with the occasional returns to its main motif being the only stabilizing force. There are some cool parts like that guitar riff near the end that should have been developed more. However, the whole track is way too disorientating and noisy, which I guess means it was successful at its job musically portraying roulette, but I think the job sucks, so it's my least favorite track here. If Elektrisches Roulette deserves any bit of praise though, it's the fact that it's the first Kraftwerk song that clearly aims to represent an object or scene. This would become a core part of their later music, and is even better demonstrated on the duo of Tongeberge and Heimatklänge, or Mountain of Sound and The Bells of Home respectively. Just the names of these tracks bring up romanticized imagery of nature and pastoral landscapes, which they recreate perfectly. Tongeberge utilizes loud soaring flutes and synths to replicate the sheer amount of space up in the mountains. It honestly kinda goes hard. Heimatklänge is a lot softer, with Florian's flute slowly and repeatedly ascending from the bed laid by Ralf's piano. It drums up beautiful images of endless forests and red trees swaying in the gentle breeze. While these are very enjoyable, they're also treated more like intermissions between larger tracks. If there's another musical concept Kraftwerk would become well known for, it's the use of songs that, while separate, complement each other or are part of a larger suite. We saw that with Tongeberge and Heimatklänge, and in between them is another duo. The first of which being Kristallo, meaning crystals. Its lead is a crystal-like synth freestyling over a marching and fluctuating acid-like synth for 6 minutes. It's cool at first, but fails to keep me completely interested. However, just when I'm starting to get bored, there is suddenly a fake ending followed by a sped up outro sandwiched by reverse sections. Odd to say the least. Tanzmusik, meaning dance music, is a better use of 6 minutes, being a bop focused on 2 delicate synths playing the lead melodies backed by several layers of percussion and droning vocals. Yep, that's another first for this album, as this is their first use of vocals on a track unless you think a temp counts. I don't. Similar to Cristallo, Tanzmusik doesn't change much over its runtime, but is far more captivating due to its adorable catchiness and diverse mix. After this comes the closer in Ananas Symphony, or Pineapple Symphony, which is a 13-minute ambient adventure filled to the brim with harps, soothing waves, and laid-back guitars and bass that all work to transport us to a tropical beach. I love this track so much. I'll admit that warm tropical stuff always hits the sweet spot for me, but it's also excellently paced and perfectly constructs a scene in stunning detail. It's also the first Kraftwerk track to have lyrics and use a vocoder, although it's just dropping the name of the song. Yes, there's this one annoying high-pitched synth in the second half that can be distracting, and the fade-out ending that comes out of nowhere is a crappy way to end a very entrancing experience. But Ananas Symphony is not only my favorite track off this album, but my favorite track from the first 3 Kraftwerk albums. Yes, I dare even say it's my 8th favorite Kraftwerk track. And yes, we'll be filling in my top 10 as we go on too. The fact that there's only one so far says a lot about how good the stuff yet to come is. So Ralf and Florian is different in many ways. It's more electronic, it's more focused, it's more creative, and most importantly, it's a lot better. It's not anywhere near perfect though. Elektrisches Roulette is a mess, Cristallo could have used a lot more work, and while Tongeberge and Heimatklänge work well as scenic intermissions, I would have liked to see more from them. But seeing all the things Kraftwerk started doing with this record that would become intrinsic to the band's identity gives it a sense of importance, which is a shame as Kraftwerk has not shown any respect to it. Kraftwerk today doesn't care much for their first 3 albums. Neither of them have gotten modern re-releases, and they have even referred to them as archaeology. This is a sentiment I can kinda understand for the first 2 albums, but not for Ralf and Florian. Regardless of recognition from the band, Ralf and Florian is where Kraftwerk musically and artistically began. It's the perfect midpoint between Kraftwerk 2 and the album that would become their big breakout. Ralf and Florian once again wasn't a hit, but it did make the US charts surprisingly enough. Nonetheless, the band's changes continued. Ralf and Florian had found some interesting ideas. However, to expand the ideas they've merely hinted at, they needed more cooks in the kitchen. First, Wolfgang Flor was brought in on electronic percussion. What made him so special was his ability to keep the beats minimalistic, something previous trained drummers struggled with. They also welcomed in Klaus Roeder to handle the guitars and violins, 2 of the few acoustic instruments Kraftwerk were still using. Also, holy shit, he does not fit in with them. With these new members, the band started recording their next album both at Kling Klang as well as Conrad Plank's studio. While Conrad and his equipment were essential to this album's sound, the recently named Kling Klang Studios cannot be ignored. We've already seen how important of a place it was for the band to experiment, create, and self-produce, but it would later become well known not only as the band's sub-label, but also the subject of a mystery, as its precise location in Dusseldorf was never specified for the longest time in the name of privacy. We know where it is now though, and it's pretty crazy how well hidden it is. They even put up a logo of an electric company to disguise the location. In 1974, Autobahn was released. Once again, you can tell it's different just from a glance. This lively, if admittedly wonky looking cover depicting the album's namesake was painted by none other than Emil Schult. The back cover is similarly goofy with a photograph of the four stuffed tightly into the back of a car. Some other versions of the album upon release don the symbol for the Autobahn used on signs in Germany, which I love for its cleverly minimalistic design and choice of color. Whatever cover is your favorite though, you have to admit it's far better than... Now, the obvious centerpiece of the album is the 22-minute long title track, their longest song. Inspired by the band's frequent trips on the Autobahn for live gigs, and Ralf wondering what it would be like to hear his band's music on the car radio, this track aims to musically represent a car ride up the famous highway. After the sound of a car driving away and honking with a synth, vocoder repetitions of the title and an iconic bass line start the song. Not long after that, the listener realizes that this is no ordinary song, but a pop song, made with synths. It's even adorned with a chorus where Ralf and Florian very awkwardly chant in German about the Autobahn. The rest of the track is centered around repetitions of that chorus with lengthy tangents in between. The first of which is beautifully scenic, with the same joyful melody being played on multiple instruments, while Florian's flute and Klaus's guitar trade improvisations. The second tangent enters a dark tunnel where the noisy percussion gets a shine. I love hearing all the cars realistically pass by. Then there's the radio section where the band tries to mimic the sounds of radio jingles and changing frequencies. It's slightly annoying, but also cute and fun. From there, the track enters its climactic finale that throws a bunch of victorious melodies both new and old together. Can you believe all of that was just one song? It's amazing, revolutionary, and Kraftwerk's most conceptual song yet. But there are a few issues I have. I know saying this is sacrilege, but 22 minutes is honestly too long for me. There's a lot of great ideas, but over 22 minutes, they stretch the format of a pop song far beyond its limits. At least it's not 40 minutes like one live version of the track, nor is it the neutering that is the 3-minute version that became a single. Being able to get a 3-minute and 40-minute version out of the same composition is very impressive though, only something that the Orb has been able to replicate ever since as far as I know. And it's thanks to Kraftwerk's open song structures. So even in this track's flaws, there is a lot to celebrate, making it my 7th favorite Kraftwerk track. But there is still another half of this album. We abruptly go from the Autobahn to deep space with the duo of Kometenmelodie 1 and 2, meaning Comet Melody 1 and 2. The first part is dark and bassy, following a slow progression of notes over a fluctuating cosmic ocean of synths for 6 minutes. It's good. Meanwhile, part 2's sudden shift into a shiny, upbeat synth-pop instrumental is shocking. Its reinterpretation of the same melody from the first part is clever, turning what was a lullaby into a playful romp. Easy choice for a single. The whole thing feels very nostalgic, not just because of its child-friendly and notably dated sound, but also due to some of its obvious imperfections in the mix. They make it so that I can't picture this song in my head without a lot of VHS degradation, which I love. The closing duo of Mitternacht and Morgenspaziergang, meaning midnight and morning walk, do not catch my affection though. These two tracks also go from dark to bright, the former painting a bleak soundscape with a foreboding 4-note melody repeating, while distant water drops, waves of noise, and Claus's squealing violin interject themselves into the mix. It's interesting, but there's little substance to it. Morgenspaziergang, however, combines a beautiful piano, guitar, and recorder to create a morning scene reusing a melody from Autobahn backed by synth birds and water. It's nice as an experimental connection to the previous albums, but while the band were able to perfectly replicate car sounds earlier, they were definitely not able to convincingly recreate nature. Some people may understandably like the obviously synthetic sound, but I don't. Also, as of Mitternacht, I would have loved to see more development. While Autobahn does have a weak ending, we can't ignore how important of an album this is. Kraftwerk took huge steps into sounds never heard before. There have been pop songs with electronic elements and electronic songs with pop appeal before, but there have never been pop songs made entirely out of electronics before this. And infusing them with carefully thought out conceptual and experimental elements is crazy. No wonder Autobahn is considered the first of the Big 8 albums by Kraftwerk, unlike previous records. However, despite its deserved classic status, it's flawed. Beyond my previous complaints about the title track's length, as well as my view that the tracks Kometen Melodie 1, Mitternacht, and Morgenspaziergang are decent at best, I also think this album's sound doesn't hold up. It was far ahead of everything else at the time, but there are still a lot of rough edges, from Autobahn's vocals, to Kometen Melodie's 5's imperfections, to Morgenspaziergang's synthetic sound effects. It's stuff like that that makes me barely prefer Ralf and Florian's more romanticized conceptual pieces. Trust me, Autobahn is a groundbreaking masterpiece, but this new sound needed to be developed and experimented with further. And that's just what Kraftwerk were going to do.
Epic rip battles of history! Kraftwerk versus Nuclear Bomb! Begin!
Unlike previous records, Autobahn surprisingly became an international success. Both the album and the title track single charted very high in several countries. It especially became a dance hit in the US and spread in the UK after a performance on the BBC. Even David Bowie became a huge fan, considering Kraftwerk his favorite band. Kraftwerk even inspired changes in his music that resulted in the Berlin trilogy. Review-wise though, there were a lot of mixed and downright hateful responses that thankfully later turned positive after the album's impacts became clear. In response to this newfound popularity, a few compilations of Kraftwerk's older stuff came out, like Acceler 8. As for changes within the band, Klaus Roeder, as well as the rest of the non-electronic instruments, were traded out for Karl Bartos, who joined in on electronic percussion and later synths despite never having any previous interest in electronic music. And my god, Kraftwerk did it! They finally got a stable lineup! Most of Kraftwerk's greatest releases would come out under this quartet of Ralf, Florian, Wolfgang, and Karl, making them undeniably Kraftwerk's classic lineup. The development of their next album was also switched up. Recording was done solely at Kling Klang Studios, with Ralf and Florian self-producing. They still wanted to make experimental electronic pop, but now with multilingual lyrics thanks to Emil Schult, switching languages frequently mid-song. This is interesting, as Kraftwerk's disinterest in using English previously made them distinctly German and separated them from other artists. However, now that they have international attention and are infusing their European identity into other parts of the music, it makes things easier for a listener like me while still getting their unique identity across. They also decided to theme their next album around radioactivity and activity on the radios. I can't be the only person that thinks this concept's lame, right? Like, it might have been seen as clever back in a time when both radioactivity and radios are far more relevant, but I mean, this entire album's concept is basically based on a pun. Anyways, Radioactivity would be released in 1975, and damn it, we're back to boring album artwork. Once again designed by Emil Schult, the front and back cover depict a radio, while the insides have a picture of the band, a nice antenna illustration, and a sheet of stickers. Looking at the track list brings a surprise though, as there's 12 whole tracks this time, so it seems they have a lot of new ideas. Many of these tracks are shorter though, like our opener in Geiger Counter, which is just a looping kick that doesn't sound much like a Geiger counter, speeding up for a minute into the epic thesis of radioactivity in its title track. The transition is so seamless, it's confusing why they're separate tracks. For 6 minutes, Radioactivity chugs along, notably featuring Ralf's improved singing about the album's main subjects, an iconic lead, epic synthetic choir, and occasional bursts of Morse code repeating the track's lyrics. Nice touch. It's a cool listen, but it doesn't go anywhere else with its ideas. Honestly, it could have used a far more epic treatment. Things calm down with Youlean, which pairs lyrics about using radios with representative sound effects over a layer of soothing synth strings.
Drehen wir am Radiophon.
It's a relaxing track, and I never get bored of seeing them fuck around with sounds, but I once again think this is just okay. Airwaves is the first track here that really grabs my attention with its exciting beat, lead pulled straight out of a sci-fi movie, electric organ, and repetitions of the phrase, "When airwaves swing, distant voices sing." It's such a fun song breathing some life into this album, especially with those improvisations throughout. But then we get into a trio of shorter tracks. Intermission has some startup sound, while News marks the grand return of uncomfortable Kraftwerk ASMR. Yippee!
Als zwei Gastanlagen das als Brennstoff für Reaktoren gebraucht wird, sind zumindest so begrenzt wie die Ölreserven, die derzeit.
And the voice of Energy boasts an awesome vocoder. The line, "I'm your servant and lord at the same time, therefore guard me well, me, the genius of energy," also being one of the best Kraftwerk lyrics.
Mich, den Genius der Energie.
There's some crazy sounds in these 3 tracks, but I'm not a fan. News especially being one of my least favorite Kraftwerk songs. Antenna at least brings back the synth poppy goodness, now with a smattering of weird effects, like the one on the vocals that I love for some reason. It's simple, steady, and odd, but one of the highlights here in my eyes. Speaking of highlights, Radio Stars is not one. I mean, the lyrics about distant pulsars and quasars are interesting, as well as some of the vocal effects, but this is easily one of Kraftwerk's most confusing and disturbing listens. It's hard for me to get through the whole thing, honestly, making it the Kraftwerk track I dislike the most. Thankfully, the last 3 songs are all pretty damn good. Uranium is my favorite of the more experimental stuff, with its large, ominous choir. It's well known for being sampled in Blue Monday by New Order, and also Renal Gauge Sonar by Aphex Twin, because I have to mention him in every video. Transistor, meanwhile, is just a cute instrumental named after the things that make the device you're watching this on work. And then the closer in Om Sui Om is more than just a really cool title. It starts out slow and mellow, led by a few synth strings. It sounds old, but as it goes, it progressively speeds up into a straight up banger. It's a great ending and best track on this messy album. Despite the consistent theming, Radioactivity musically couldn't figure out what it wanted to be. It's stuck between a continuation of Autobahn synth pop and a return to their experimental roots. This is not helped by the fact that these songs needed more time in the oven. Autobahn came out just 11 months before this, mind you, part of which was occupied by a tour. It's a shame as there are a lot of great ideas here. Each track had potential, but only a few of them sound fully realized. The experimental side of this album is inconsistent, and while I do enjoy its synth-pop leanings more, I feel like later albums hit harder and sound far better. But even then, I still have to give some appreciation to this album for once again pushing electronic music into new directions, even if I don't like all of them. This elevates Radioactivity over Kraftwerk 1 and 2 in my eyes, but still leaves it as the worst of the big 8. Radioactivity was slightly less successful than Autobahn, but was very popular in France. Reviews were once again mixed, but retrospectively became more positive. Now, heading into 1976, what crazy things were happening in the band? Surely they were completely reinventing their sound yet again, or doing massive amounts of drugs, right? Well, no, not really. Kraftwerk mainly focused on refining their music in several ways, from adding more advanced equipment to their repertoire, to balancing out their experimental and pop aspirations, to no longer playing on stage while drunk. Wait, what? And they took their time with these things, spending the entirety of 1976 working on the next album and playing live. Some of the ideas coming out of it were looking very interesting. They were now going to make separate German and English recordings. This is definitely for the better, as even on Radioactivity, you missed a lot from ignoring the German lyrics. The next album was taking on multiple themes too, like that of transportation, appearances versus reality, and European history and culture, inspired by Dusseldorf's unique connections to other European countries. In 1977, these ideas were realized when Trans-Europe Express was released. The album's design was more involved than previous records, but was still led by Emil Schult. You may assume I'll find it boring, but that's not the case. Trans-Europe Express's design was specifically made to be retro and kitschy, to keep in line with the album's themes. Also, no one can look at this and not say it's the best piece of art ever made. I mean, come on. However, a world where I don't continually nitpick album artwork is one I don't want to live in, so holy shit, why are Ralf and Wolfgang so tiny? Trans-Europe Express starts with the 9-minute monster that is Europe Endless. It begins with this upbeat sequence that continues throughout the entire track. It's quickly joined by a choir and jaunty bass line. The song properly starts with the introduction of a tight dance beat, a soaring lead, and Ralf singing with lovely vocoder backup vocals. For 8 minutes, the track proceeds steadily with lyrics about the various sights one can see while traveling through Europe, with synth solos in between that get my dopamine flowing. There's absolutely no criticisms I can think for Europe Endless. These 9 minutes fly by, and the track's central groove is so good that it's impossible for me to not bounce in my seat while listening to it. As a whole, Europe Endless even outclasses previous records in depicting scenic environments. This is easily the best song they've made yet. I dare even say it's my 4th favorite track of theirs. Next, we delve into darker spaces with the Hall of Mirrors. This one is built off an 8-bit arpeggio, distant footsteps, simple bass, and crystalline lead. Together, they create an atmosphere that is both haunting yet entrancing. The most interesting thing about the song is its lyrics. They reflect on how young celebrities change into drastically different personas, often to combat perceived flaws in themselves, making some very poignant observations for the band that talked about driving for 22 minutes.
Even the greatest stars change themselves in the looking glass.
What really solidifies the Hall of Mirrors into another highlight, though, is the solo later on in the track. It's the perfect addition. The count-in intro on Showroom Dummies lets us know this next track will be different. It has a far angrier combination of another type beat with snare hits that feel like punches to the face, a modulating bass line, angsty lead synth, dark choir, and a slightly rougher mix.
We are standing here, exposing ourselves.
Well, that's starting to make a bit more sense. The lyrics are once again surprisingly deep. On the surface, they're about mannequins that come to life, but it's actually a dig at a critic who criticized Kraftwerk for their not-so-lively presence at concerts, which I mean is blatantly false. Look at how much fun they're having! I kid, but it's hard to find a better clapback to a critic than this, especially with its awesome finale.
Our showroom dummies.
Showroom Dummies was the second single for Trans-Europe Express, a French recording of which was even made at the request of Maxime Schmidt. Now it's time for the title track, first single, an epic suite of this album. It gets its name from an intercontinental luxury train service, and the idea for the song was suggested by Paul Alessandrini. It immediately hits you with one of the best percussive grooves of all time, with flanged hi-hats mimicking the sound of a train on tracks over a mock acoustic kit. I could probably listen to it for an hour and still have a blast. The iconic and intimidating string chord progression adds a lot to it as well. This track also notably includes more interesting experiments with the Doppler effect and an admittedly iffy lead. The vocals are more relaxed and tell of a trip across Europe via the song's namesake, ending with a meeting with David Bowie and Iggy Pop. They actually did meet at one point, and Kraftwerk were big fans of both artists, even referencing Station to Station.
From station to station, back to Düsseldorf city. Meet Iggy Pop and David Bowie.
What I like more about the lyrics, though, are the images they bring up of an interconnected Europe, something that stood in opposition to the reality of the Iron Curtain. Ralf even referred to these lyrics as a fantasy, one that has thankfully been realized, mostly, in the present day. Trans-Europe Express is another one of my all-time favorite Kraftwerk tracks. I'd even place it right behind Europe Endless. But we still have the rest of the suite to get through. Before long, it transitions into Metal on Metal, a proto-industrial interlude that further experiments with TEE's atmospheres and beat. It adds several metallic, percussive sound effects that develop upon what was already a perfect groove. The final part of the suite is Abzug, which on some early copies was included in Metal on Metal. It goes back to where TE left off, but now with a high-pitched synth rhythmically repeating the same note, while the album's name is chanted 36 times. Not as great as the start of the suite, but still a decent ending to it.
Trans-Europe Express. Trans-Europe Express.
After the train arrives at the station, we are finally pulled out of the darkness by Franz Schubert. A tribute to the Austrian composer, this is a relaxing track that reuses the same sequence at the heart of Europe Endless, but now with beautiful synth accentuations. It's nothing special, but definitely needed after that suite. This goes into the short closer of Endless Endless, which repeats the same vocoded vocals from Europe Endless while everything else fades out. Something about the lush delay on the vocal just absolutely floors me every time. I wish it never ended and just kept going on. But that's Trans-Europe Express. One hell of an album. Its themes are a bit all over the place, but its sound is not. This fusion of synth-pop with European musical tradition is totally unique to this album, and I love it so much. I think Kraftwerk mastered almost everything about their sound with this album too. They mastered their electronic percussion, making all these weird tracks danceable. They mastered atmosphere and scenery, creating soundscapes both beautiful and creepy without overindulging. They mastered their musical depictions of objects and places, making this album like a supercharged Autobahn. They mastered pacing because at no point in this album do I ever get even close to bored. Really, my only complaints besides some of the tracks being weaker than others are that the synths and mixing sometimes sound off, but they also occasionally add to the album's charm. So Trans-Europe Express is amazing, deep, creative, and what's even crazier is that Kraftwerk were only going to get better. Trans-Europe Express performed better sales-wise, but was still not near the success of Autobahn. Initial reviews this time were actually pretty damn good. It seems like critics were finally waking up to how great this new sound was. The same could be said for the public too, as artists were starting to release more electronic music to even more acclaim, the biggest example being Donna Summer's I Feel Love. Produced and written by Giorgio Moroder, I Feel Love came at the end of a concept album about music's past, with this track representing music's future. It was a huge hit that became a huge influence on dance music, as well as the LGBTQ music scene. Kraftwerk must have been listening too, because their next album was going to be about the future. They've always been a forward-thinking band, but their previous records have almost exclusively been about the music of the past or the technologies of the present. However, this time, they're going to pay homage to the future with The Man Machine, which came out in 1978. Right away, the album's artwork is different from anything the band's done before. This time done by Karl Klefisch, it was inspired by Russian constructivism, propagandistic art that envisioned a future designed by scientists and built by engineers. It can be seen in the packaging, straight lines, and striking use of red, black, and white. L. Lissitzky, an artist associated with Russian constructivism, was specifically named as an inspiration. The pictures of the band depict them in robotically stiff poses, making the viewer question whether the band are actually real people. Their public image was already very professional and anti-rock and roll, but this, as well as the opener, only proved that they actively embraced their emotionless exteriors. That opening track and first single is The Robots, which slowly evolves from a menagerie of weird robotic sound effects into a melodic synth-pop jam. This whole track is a satisfying listen, from the laser for a snare to the background synths that occasionally creep into the foreground. Ralf sings about how the band are just robots at your command, with some obvious parallels to showroom dummies.
Your function automatic, and we are dancing mechanic.
It's a simple but great song, although I wish there was more done with its bare-bones composition. Despite this, The Robots became a huge song for Kraftwerk, not only being a defining statement about their self-image, but also becoming an event at live shows where they pretended to be robots or were actually replaced by dancing robots. Or at least I think they're dancing. I'm not exactly sure. The next track is Space Lab. It gets its name from the laboratory used for experiments by the European Space Agency on board space shuttles. This track is a far more atmospheric listen, with some lovely melodies and cheesy sci-fi vibe going on that is irresistible. lyrics just repeat the title, but with an awesome vocal effect. Even with all that, this is my least favorite on the album. Not because it's weak, but because everything else after is just so good. For example, Metropolis. Its intro is unnerving, with these buzzing synths rising in pitch. The song starts with this fast bass line that's joined by dramatic pads, mournful leads, and another satisfying snare. The instrumental has an epic and menacing feel, and the atmosphere is spot on. The lyrics are once again repetitions of the title, but I really like the over-exaggerated pronunciation for some reason. Meteoric. Despite the few lyrics, the listener has no trouble imagining scenes out of the 1927 movie of the same name, with its towering skyscrapers and rhythmically moving machinery, but this time drenched in a prominent shade of red. Really, it's clever how Metropolis communicates all of this with just one word. Next up is The Model, the second single that would become the biggest hit off this album 3 years after its release. We'll get to that later. This is easily the most straightforward pop song Kraftwerk has ever made. Previous synth-pop tracks had little quirks like being about antennas or being 22 minutes long, but everything about The Model is as radio-friendly as it gets. That's not a bad thing either, as this is a great track. The beat is snappy and the melodic synths are pristine. The bassline is catchy as hell and is also sampled by 808 State, so hell yeah.
He's a model and she's looking good.
The lyrics break new ground for the band, not talking about any machine or place, but rather a person. Specifically, an up-and-coming model whose beauty attracts tons of men. Different territory than Kraftwerk is used to, but despite the fact the narrator clearly has feelings for her, they're described in such a detached way. I like to take her home, that's understood. Now she's a big success, I want to meet her again. Pretty interesting. Overall, The Model is a perfectly composed, if not a bit old-sounding synth-pop song. Although cutting out 8 seconds on the CD version is a weird, creative decision. I didn't really mind it though. The next track, in Neon Lights, is the longest here, and it's absolutely adorable. The instrumental is very innocent, and most of its length comes from prominently gated synth solos. That must have been the coolest thing when this album came out. The concise lyrics pay admiration to Neon Lights, something we rarely think about but are important for lighting up the night.
And at the fall of night, this city's made of light.
In that respect, this track is the antithesis of Metropolis. Where that depicts the future as this intimidating industrial force, this shows technology can make the world a more beautiful place. That and the way the synth near the end seemingly cries out for this future is what makes Neon Lights my 6th favorite Kraftwerk track. And spoiler alert, the finale and title track is my 10th favorite. Lyrically, it goes over the same ground as the Robots, but there are so many other things I love about this track. However, I'll keep it to just 3. Firstly, it has this album's best percussion work, especially that unforgettable clicking rhythm. Secondly, that one lead synth completely predicted the entire sound of the 80s. And lastly, that grainy yet ghostly vocoder is fucking awesome, especially in how the vocals smoothly fade in and out. It's especially effective on the chorus that always knocks me off my feet. For just 6 tracks, the Man Machine sure packs a punch, and it does all this while being probably their most straightforward album yet. The emphasis on minimalism helps this album though, as it results in Kraftwerk's best produced, structured, and paced album yet, with every track being unique. Its observations on the future must have been deeply compelling in 1978, and some of them, whether in the music or the design, are still insightful today. I can only imagine how crazy this must have sounded at the time. I won't pretend it's completely timeless, as it has a perspective about the future that is very different from today, but there is a reason why after all these years, Kraftwerk have made very few edits to the Man Machine as a whole. This is their best album, and there is no doubt in my mind about it. However, that will be it for now, as we have gone through enough for just one video. Even after all of that, we've only gone through like half their discography, so in part 2, we'll finish the second half. See you there.